So, Michael, thanks so much for being on the show again.
Oh, thanks for having me again. I always enjoy talking with you.
I'm sort of fascinated to talk about some of these topics that you've been thinking about, researching, writing about since we last spoke. And I was going to start. You suggested we talk a little bit about the question so many people have, like, "Am I normal? is this
Right.
is this okay? Is it what about me is so different or wrong? Right? What are the kinds of things that people worry aren't normal?
Well, I answer questions on a website. I have a website called greatsexguidance.com, and I answer people's sex questions for free. Um, and I've gotten thousands of questions. I've had this website for more than 10 years.
Oh, wow.
And, people ask all kinds of things, but one of the most frequently asked questions in various guises is, am I normal? I'm into this. Is that okay? And I think the reason people ask that question is that in our culture, sexuality is both celebrated and attacked and demonized, which leaves a whole lot of people confused
Yeah.
about, what they should be doing. And unfortunately, our culture has a lot of people who are raised in very sex negative environments, people who are raised with their parents telling them sex is okay to make babies, and it's okay to express love for your spouse, but anything else is not only wrong, but horrible, and you're going to go to hell.
Yeah.
And so this is a really mixed message that gives people, the willies. And I get these a lot more from men, these
Mm,
questions, than from women, because men are generally more into solo sex. And solo sex is one of the, well, first of all, it's the world's most popular form of lovemaking.
right.
Or,
I'm sure it's the most common. Yeah.
yes, it's the most common. But it's also fraught because so many religions, and in the United States, conservative Christians and other religions, I mean, Orthodox Jews, for example,
Right.
demonize solo sex. And so but virtually everyone has done it.
Right.
So people will write to me and say, I know. Oh, I got one recently from a guy who said, I know it's okay to self sex, but I'm doing it 6 times a week. Is that normal?
Right. As
And
if there's a magic number, right?
so, I mean, the bottom line in all these am I normal questions is, unless you're doing something that is a felony, you're talking about child sex abuse, sexual assault against another person,
Right.
unless you're committing a crime, you're normal.
Yeah.
And the default position should be that you are normal. And so people who are more interested in sex than all of their friends, that's normal. Some
Right.
people are very interested in sex. People who are into sex that's different from what their friends are into. So LGBTQ A and the whole thing. People who are into kink, BDSM, perfectly normal.
Yeah.
And on and on and on. People who like to have sex, in the great outdoors. That's normal as long as you're not committing legally arrestable exhibitionism.
Right.
Um, so basically, the whole am I normal thing, the whole issue is a reflection of how badly we do public health sex education in the United States, that we don't tell people that basically pretty much everything is normal.
Yeah.
And, and when you look at the research, what's so amazing to me is that more than half of the United States population admits to having sex that is generally considered unconventional.
Hmm.
A majority of people have played with things like blindfold, spanking, public sex, sex in cars, on and on and on.
Right.
Things that are considered a little iffy are actually quite popular.
Right.
And so there again, the default position should be you're normal unless you're committing a crime.
Yeah. I mean, I'm sort of struck too. It's not just the explicit messages that people might have gotten from their parents or their faith or something. It's like the lack of talking about it. The vacuum creates this idea of like, I don't know what's normal or what's right or what anyone else is doing. You know,
Right.
we have no way. Most people, in my experience, aren't going to know that what they're doing is different than all their friends because they aren't talking about it with anybody, you know? So
Or if they ask their friends, oh, I'm doing this, is that okay? A lot of people who are sexually, shall we say, uninformed or misinformed will say, you're not normal,
yeah.
when in fact they are.
Yeah. I mean, therapists included, right? Like sometimes people they bring their own stuff in here and
Right.
judge their clients based on their own, their own sense of what's right or wrong.
Yeah, so I'm sure you've had situations where people have come to you with a anguished story and you're sitting there thinking, what's the problem? I don't
Yeah.
see a problem.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
get that all the time.
You must get a lot of questions too. I mean, I know it shows up in my therapy practice, like just the things that we find arousing. Is that normal to be aroused by this or by that or by, like,
Oh yeah,
eh,
yeah. The fetishes and people who are into feet and dressing up, role play, all this stuff. And people will say, I've got a question recently when someone said, I just get so excited to have sex in the car. And this, is that okay? And I said, well, the way today's cars are being made, it's a lot harder to have sex in the back seat than it was in the 1950s when
right,
back seats were like sofas. But no, it's fine as long as you're not doing it out in public in front of a police officer.
right. Or in elementary school or something. Right.
So I think the more that sex researchers delve into sex, the greater diversity they find,
Yeah.
and the greater the width of what's considered normal has expanded fantastically in the last 30 or 40 years. I mean, BDSM used to be considered not just abnormal, but a mental illness.
Yeah. So I was going to ask you about that. We're talking about some of the kinky stuff. Like, do people still think that like something is wrong with me or this is just a trauma response or, uh,
Uh,
this means something's broken.
yes, a lot of people who are attracted to elements of BDSM think something is wrong with them.
Yeah.
But I have to say, BDSM is one of the areas where we have actually made tremendous progress as a culture in seeing it as normal, not because of anything that sex educators did, not because of anything that therapists have done, but because of 50 Shades of Grey.
Wow.
When 50 Shades of Grey, which is the BDSM romance trilogy,
Right.
that came out in 2011.
Okay.
And it has become the third most popular novel of all time. The first one is Don Quixote, which was published 600 years ago.
Okay.
Number two is A Tale of Two Cities by Dickens, that was published 250 years ago. And then there's 50 Shades of Grey that has sold 150 million copies in 20 years.
That's really kind of mind blowing to me.
And
Yeah.
and the um and the way that our culture has embraced 50 Shades of Grey, it's been quiet, but it's been incredibly pervasive. I mean, the movies are very popular. And 50 Shades of Grey essentially has gone a long way to normalizing many elements of BDSM. Now, BDSM comes in many flavors, from people who get into a little blindfolding, a little light spanking, to people who have whole dungeons and get into some very heavy stuff.
Right.
Um, but the idea here is that BDSM is a form of play.
Right.
Sex, sex is adult play that eventually extends to the genitals.
Yeah.
And BDSM is play with two consensual partners who decide what they're going to do. They set up the rules, they have safe words,
Uh-oh.
But of course, some people still think it's not only wrong, but horrible and a reflection of mental illness. And until recently, the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, the Bible of mental health conditions from the American Psychiatric Association, until recently, it did list BDSM as pathological. But fortunately, a great number of sex researchers and educators were very loud in the compilation of the most recent edition, which came out in 2013. And all BDSM and similar fetish play was expunged, is no longer considered a mental health condition. And I sincerely hope that that percolates
Yeah.
through society so that people are a little less fraught. I look forward to a day where people don't ask me that question anymore, but I don't know when that's going to happen.
Yeah. I mean, it just seems to me like our culture, maybe it's the whole world, but it was just waiting for the permission. 50 Shades of Grey, somebody dared to put it out there and talk
Right.
about it. And like everybody was like, oh my goodness,
Well,
this is all right.
as you know, so much of sex education and therapy is giving people permission
Yeah.
to be who they are,
Right.
to say to them, "You're okay. It's okay."
Yeah. I'm curious, having gotten these questions for 10 years, have you done any data analysis on it? I don't know what you collect about people, male, female, ages, the kinds of questions. It would be fascinating to me, really, to take the data set that you've got at this point.
Um, well, that's an interesting idea. I've never done that. And I did my own, I before I had my website, I answered sex questions for other media. In fact, some of your older podcast listeners may remember Playboy magazine, which in the 20th century, in the last half of the 20th century, was the single biggest source of sex education for young men.
Hmm.
And Playboy had a column called The Advisor where people would ask questions. And I answered all the sex questions for 5 years.
Wow. Okay.
And I answered about a dozen questions a month for 5 years. And then I answered sex questions for a number of other sites. For example, WebMD used to have a Q&A thing that I was one of a couple of sex people who answered questions. But I've never really thought about doing any, research on it because I don't know why. I guess I'm not. I always read the research. I just don't do it.
Yeah. Yeah. It just seems fascinating that you've got quite a data set there. What would you say are some of the trends? Like, how have the questions changed over a decade or more that you've been doing this? Like, what are the new themes or are there new themes? Are there new
Well,
things that are being asked now that weren't asked a decade ago?
I get a lot fewer questions about LGBTQ. People, there's still tremendous stigmatization in some quarters about people who are not exclusively heterosexual. But the culture as a whole has moved on beyond that. And there are still young people coming of age every day
Hmm.
are LGBTQ who don't know that they're all right.
Yeah.
But the level of questions about that has subsided. Um, the questions about women ask fewer questions about, oh my God, I can't have an orgasm. Is something wrong with me?
Okay.
And there again, that is another victory
Yes,
for,
I was going to say that's a sign that people are learning,
yes.
yeah,
And
how anatomy works.
the Masters and Johnson, the original sex researchers, they came up with a cure for a way that women who were not having orgasms could have them, and they did that in 1970. So that's 50 years ago, and so that's two generations. So
Yeah.
over 2 generations, more and more women and their friends and their mothers and aunts are there to tell them, hey, here's all you have to do.
Yeah.
And right now, more than one half of adult women in the United States own at least one vibrator. And so there are fewer questions about why can't I come?
Yeah.
Um, let's see, what else?
Are there more questions about, I don't know, maybe like porn, or maybe that's just been so pervasive this whole time?
Porn, yes, there are tremendous questions about porn. And in my book, Sizzling Sex for Life, I have a 7-chapter package all about pornography. Because that book is certainly welcomes women readers, but it's aimed at men. It's aimed at telling men uh, how to make love better to women, and also how to understand themselves better. And uh, men love porn. I mean, it's one of the top destinations for men on the internet.
Yeah.
And there are more than 3 billion porn pages. And so porn is huge. And a lot of men feel very guilty about it. Again, particularly those raised in sex negative environments,
Mm-hmm.
demonize masturbation because porn is basically fundamentally a visual aid for self-sexing. That's
Right.
that's its function.
Right.
Uh, you know, um, Playboy used to be called a one-handed magazine. And that's what porn is. You know, you've
Right.
got one hand on the curse on the mouse and the other hand somewhere else.
Right.
Um, and so that's very fraught with a lot of men. And I try to say, hey, it's normal. Self-sexing is normal. So therefore, using visual aids for self-sexing, that's also normal.
Do you get questions about, I mean, I still read in social media or sometimes even in sexual health channels concern that somehow self-sex, porn use, whatever, is resulting in AD or a lower desire, or
Right.
lose interest in actual people, or do
Right.
people express those kind of concerns?
Yes, there's right now, there's a what I consider to be a quite pernicious little dark alley on the internet, on Reddit sites called NoFap.
Right.
The NoFap people say you should not engage in solo sex, that it's going to harm you in some way. And that when you swear off fapping, all of a sudden you have all this energy and you're so great and you're going to be rich, Um, no,
Yeah.
it's that's ridiculous. That's preposterous.
Yeah.
The NoFap thing is a completely wrong-headed, misguided, extremely reactionary, socially conservative, uh, run down the wrong alley. Um, but there's a lot of that. I get questions about, oh, I read on NoFap that I shouldn't do this. And what do you think, Mike? And I say, well, I think NoFap is full of it.
Yeah. Yeah. What about teens and porn? I think you wrote a note here that said 3/4 of teens have viewed online porn. I don't know if I think that number is high or low, given its availability.
I guess, I don't know, it must be 6 or 8 months ago, a good study came out that surveyed a huge number of adolescents, high schoolers, and it came up with the finding that 3/4 of them had seen online porn. And of course, this made headlines.
Right.
And social conservatives, oh my God, ooh. The assumption being that if teens see porn, there must be something wrong with it.
Right.
That seeing things that are sexually explicit has to be bad for people, where in fact, that's not the case at all.
Hmm.
I mean, our ancestors, 200 years ago, the typical American lived in a 1 or 2 room cottage where everyone had the same bedroom. Everyone slept in the same room, often in the same bed. And parents had sex right in front of their children.
Right.
Now, they didn't say, kids, come around, your mom and I are going to have sex. No,
Right.
everyone went to bed, the kids went to bed, then the parents went to bed and started playing around. And sometimes the kids woke up in the middle of the night and saw it.
Right.
So our great grandparents did not have internet pornography. They had real sex happening right in front of them in their own bedrooms.
Right.
Um, the same thing is true of animal husbandry. you know, until until World War One, the vast majority of Americans lived on farms, and those farms had domesticated animals. And the fecundity of those animals was very important to the economic and actual life survival of the family. If all your cows died, you were in big trouble. And so animal husbandry was a very important part of life for the vast majority of Americans. And the reproduction of animals was equally important. And farmers and their families and ranchers got elbow deep into it.
Right.
And the kids stood around and watched. And they knew all about what went where. So the idea, and no one says they were harmed. No one says that they were harmed, or that farm kids were harmed in the 1890s when they saw, horses copulating. um, it was fine, and it's still fine. So I think that it's so sad that we demonize sex media,
Yeah.
and yet violent media is like totally normal. If the Fast and Furious franchise has, 50 movies in it where people just spend their time, disemboweling each other.
Right.
To me, that's a lot more disturbing than two people being filmed making love on a beach.
But let me ask you this, because I think this will be a question in people's brains. I mean, porn isn't sex, it's fantasy. And what people are doing in this porn, you know, is often a lot different than what people would have woken up to 200 years
Exactly.
ago, right? It's not just two people making love on a beach, right? There's
Right.
the variety and the ease of finding all kinds of stuff there. It's different, right, than
Uh,
just sex.
I'm not a total supporter of porn. The porn is male fantasies. Porn is a fantasy that men have of unlimited sex on demand with no responsibilities at all.
Right.
And and that's great in fantasy, but it does not work in real life. And what the problem with porn, as far as I'm concerned, is that it's bad for sex. If when men try to imitate porn, they develop all the sex problems that men don't want to have. They become at higher risk for premature ejaculation, erection difficulties, and inability to ejaculate. The reason is that porn is 95% genital and 5% sensual. And by sensual, I mean things like kissing, hugging, holding each other, massaging each other, touching each other's faces, scalp, ears, back, elbows, knees, touch of all the places other than the genitals. That is sensuality. And what we have learned over and over and over again from sex research is that for the genitals to work properly in lovemaking, you have to have everything else get touched too.
Right.
And so I am constantly beating a drum that men, number one, they should slow down in their lovemaking. And then after they've slowed down, they should slow down a lot more. Um, and I say to people, I encourage people to make love while listening to music. I love music, and it's a wonderful accompaniment to lovemaking. And I tell men, don't touch her between the legs for 5 songs. 5 songs, count 5 songs, and touch her everywhere else but there for 5 songs. And at the end of 5 songs, chances are she will be open to genital play. And so the problem with pornography is not that it exists, not that people watch it, but the fact that it's bad for lovemaking. It's
Right.
bad for sex. It produces bad sex.
But
Um,
is this a place where it becomes potentially problematic for teenagers to view it because they may, I mean, first of all, they may not understand it's just male fantasy. This isn't how it works. Uh, they're getting a different picture, like a distorted
right.
view potentially. So is there, I don't know if there's research or thought on, um, it's not the
There is
fact that it's sexual explicit, but it's, I don't know, it's given them the wrong ideas somehow.
research on this where teens have been polled about, do you watch porn? What do you think of it? And most teens consider it educational in that it's the only place where you actually see people doing it.
Right.
Most teens also recognize that it's fantasy, that it's not real. Um, and of course, some kids don't. Some kids try to imitate porn and see it as a documentary rather than
Yeah.
fantasy. They
Right.
see it as a textbook, um, and that's why guys like me keep saying, "Hey, it's fantasy. It's not real. It's." I say that I compare porn. I say that porn is like the chase scenes in action movies.
Mm,
They're exciting and they're fun to watch, but they're not the way to drive.
right. I
And
love that.
everyone knows that they're not the way to drive because to get a driver's license, you have to learn how to drive properly.
Yeah.
And, and you don't drive like they do in chase scenes in action movies. The same thing is true of porn. Porn is exciting, it's fun to watch, but it's not the way to make love. In fact, for men who want to be high quality lovers, they should do the opposite of what they see in porn. So, porn is 95% genital. You want to have your sex to be a lot less genital for the first half hour or so, and then feel free.
Yeah. All right. Last question I have for you is about social media and sort of how that intersects with, overlaps with sex problems, with expectations around it. I don't know what kind of question, if the questions you're getting are partly about, hey, I'm seeing this on social, but
Well,
thoughts?
social media debuted with a grand promise that it would connect everybody in the world with each other.
Yeah.
And it would be this vast, wonderful web where people were all, closer to each other and able to communicate so much better. And and yes, sometimes that's true.
Yeah.
But often what we find, and the research is very clear on this, the more people are involved in social media, the more lonely they are, the
Mm,
less they connect with real people. They're lonely, they're depressed, and because they're lonely and depressed, those two elements are not good for sex.
okay.
So there's a correlation between time spent on social media and reports of sex problems. The more time people spend on social media, the more sexual difficulties they report to researchers.
Hmm.
And it's a shame because, at its best, social media is a good thing.
Hmm.
But some people become so obsessed with it and so deeply involved that they lose themselves and they don't make connections in real life. And so that's where there's a whole thread of psychological and sexological research that correlates uh, time spent in social media environments with interpersonal problems, including sex. Now, I'm not saying that we should ban social media. That's impossible. You might as well say, let's ban porn. You can't do it. But I think people need to understand that the mass media are a potentially good source of information, potentially a source of support, but not necessarily. And
Yeah.
that if you get too deep into them for too long, you're likely to regret it.
Yeah. I mean, I'm thinking not only does it maybe replace interactions with actual people, so all our interactions are online instead of connecting in real life, but it also seems like the nature of what you're shown in your feed. That first of all, people are presenting only, oh, that's all my best life. I mean, there's a certain amount of, I don't know what you'd call that, positioning or posing or something, right? There's everybody else seems to be having a great time. What's wrong with me?
Right. Yes, there's a phrase that's coming up that Facebook is all birthday cakes and no funerals.
Yeah.
So it's exactly what you said. It's happy stuff, and that's great. It's people should celebrate what's happy in their lives. Life is tough, and when something good happens, it's good to celebrate it.
Right.
But life is multifaceted. And when all people see is other people's birthday cakes, they go, well, how come no one cares about me?
Yeah. Yeah, and then I'm thinking it's not all happy stuff because you also get these major, trolls and divisiveness and this heated. I mean, I, I can barely even stand it anymore, with the negativity and the vitriol that is pervasive in social
Yes.
media too.
The yes, the internet seems to select and reinforce anger.
Yeah.
When people get angry on the internet, and was a cartoon some years ago, I don't know, 10, 15 years ago, there was a cartoon of a guy sitting at a desk, and there's a half moon out the window, it's dark, it's night, and he's at his computer, and what he's saying is, in a minute, honey, it's just that somebody posted something on the internet that's wrong. And
I got to correct every wrong statement.
yes,
Yeah. Before I can go to bed. Yeah.
the function of the internet seems to be to rile people up.
Well, it drives engagement, right? If somebody's angry, you're more likely to respond, you're more likely to stay. I mean, they must be
Exactly right. And
right.
so when you have a medium that's all about attracting eyeballs, you get a lot of anger, you get a lot of conflict, you get a lot of people stirring up anger and conflict to get more eyeballs, to get more advertising revenue.
Right.
It's
Yeah.
sad.
Yeah.
It drives me crazy, but that's our world now.
Yeah. So, do you mind sharing where people can ask you these questions or anything else you'd like to mention about where they find you or what you've got available for people?
Yes, my website is greatsexguidance.com. And I try to answer questions within 72 hours, and I usually can manage that. And for information, if people want a comprehensive look at sex information, I would recommend my recent book, Sizzling Sex for Life, available on Amazon and Bookshop and wherever fine books are sold. And it's a sort of cradle to grave sex guide that talks about all the common questions at every stage of life.
Yeah. Great. Thank you so much for being on the show.
Well, thanks for having me again. Nice to see you.